So let me start with Sergio Marxuach, and we will, for his brief remarks, and then we'll move down the table for their initial thoughts.
Good morning, and thank you all for being here this day in Washington, D.C. I just want to bring Professor Velasquez's discussion a little bit down to the level of Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico, as you all know, it's not a sovereign country, neither is a state of the union, so that presents several issues. We have no authority to negotiate international treaties, no access to emergency financing for multilateral institutions, no monetary policy instruments whatsoever, limited fiscal policy tools, nominal representation in Congress, and the U.S. Supreme Court has repeatedly decided that it's permissible for Congress to discriminate against Puerto Rico in the application of federal programs as long as there exists a rational basis for doing so. That means that we don't have the tools to deal with this problem, essentially. So in order to implement a comprehensive solution, we're going to need legislation both at the federal level and at the Puerto Rico level. At the federal level, it's pretty much inevitable that some debt resolution mechanism will have to be implemented. At this point in the discussion, it's pretty much useless to argue otherwise. The debate right now is whether it's going to be an orderly restructuring or a chaotic restructuring, and that's going to be up to the government of Puerto Rico and the creditors to decide. Secondly, there has been a lot of discussion of fiscal oversight, as Professor Velasco mentioned. I agree 100% with him. Everybody says, oh, we need this fiscal oversight. No one has the slightest idea as to what this fiscal oversight will be or what this board will do. Just came down from the Hill yesterday with talking with some very senior people, both in the House and the Senate, and they themselves have no idea what this fiscal oversight board will do. For CNE, it's very important that whatever board's implemented be accountable, have representation from the people of Puerto Rico, be transparent in the way it works. It cannot be a blank check to do whatever the hell it wants. And it cannot have plenary powers over spending and taxation because it will simply not be acceptable to the people of Puerto Rico or to the political class of Puerto Rico. Within those boundaries, we're willing to look at whatever is proposed out there. Third component is we need some short-term fiscal and economic stabilization measures. And there has been a lot of proposals put on the table around this, things like the Jones Act, cuts in payroll taxes, EITC, but again, there has been no set policy decision made as far as we can tell. Moving down to Puerto Rico then, Puerto Rico for its part would have to enact a fiscal responsibility law. Very similar to what Professor Velasco mentioned. And you may say, well, Puerto Rico already has a constitutional requirement to balance the budget and a whole bunch of other rules on the books. My colleague here, Ms. Gordon, Tracy Gordon, will talk about how those rules have worked or not worked in the 49 states out of the 50 that have some sort of balanced budget requirement. In Puerto Rico, essentially existing legal provisions have not worked. They have neither led to balanced budgets or controlled debt growth. Furthermore, as Professor Velasco mentioned, requiring a balanced budget across all points of the cycle is economically inefficient and very costly from a political perspective. That's why we need to look at new legal provisions that supplement or in a way improve these provisions we already have on the books, which, by the way, the reason precisely for which they don't work is that bankers and lawyers were very creative when Puerto Rico had a lot of money. There's a lot of share guilt here. Puerto Rico did not get in debt by itself. It was able to sell all that debt because, as Professor Velasco mentioned, a lot of bankers and creative lawyers and accountants came knocking on the door to design clever ways to get around these constitutional and legal provisions. The problem with that is once you have a constitutional reinterpretation of a constitutional provision, for example, saying that the government can use debt as available resources to balance a budget, which is essentially counting more borrowed money as revenues, it's very hard to reverse that, because then the next governor will also like to do that for his or her own purposes. That's why a more flexible but credible set of rules eliminates the incentives to, invent ways around them. A fiscal rule in Puerto Rico would have to look at several things. It would have to provide the necessary flexibility to deal with contingencies. It will need to set a very strict cap on expenditures by the central government every year. And within that expenditure limit, there will be programmatic flexibility for politicians to allocate money among programs. So in that way, it's also democratic. It sets a strict cap, and within that cap, then politicians allocate among and between the different programs that they think are necessary for the government to run. In order for this to run in Puerto Rico, though, there are several obstacles that we need to deal with. First, we need a broad political agreement on the nature and setting of the fiscal targets, and that's easier said than done. As one staffer yesterday on the Hill told me, a guy who had been dealing with Puerto Rico for 30 years, politics is a blood sport in Puerto Rico. So we definitely need to deal with that part. Second, it's important to define clearly which entities of the government are going to be subject to the target. And this is a very important question in Puerto Rico, because it's not only the central government, we also have a whole bunch of state-owned enterprises, we have 78 municipalities, so the decision has to be made as to what entities will be subject to the rule and which would not be subject to the rule. Third, it is essential to establish an agreed-upon methodology for carrying out this exercise. And this is extremely important, given that the methodology that's used will produce either a good rule or a bad rule. And we obviously want, as Professor Velasco said, a smart rule. Finally, it is necessary to generate the inputs that are used to run this methodology, and this is a very complicated economic exercise. Unfortunately, as many of you know, economic data in Puerto Rico is of very poor quality. And one of the benefits or spillover effects, actually, of implementing this kind of rule is that national statistics in Puerto Rico will have to be improved. So it's kind of the creation of a public good that would be used not only by government, but also will be very useful for private sector businesses, looking at how their businesses will be affected in the future, and as well for investors that are seeking to invest in Puerto Rico. Finally, we also have the second component of that Puerto Rico Fiscal Responsibility Law would have to be a complete overhaul of Puerto Rico fiscal institutions, which I think pretty much everybody agrees are deficient, transparent, and do not operate in the way they're supposed to work. We're talking about the Puerto Rico Treasury Department, the Puerto Rico Office of Management and Budget, and the Government Development Bank. We need to establish new procedures to coordinate policies among and between these agencies. We need to significantly upgrade their operational and execution capabilities, establish an integrated financial management information system, and improve in a significant manner internal controls, internal audit, and real cost monitoring capabilities. Essentially, the entire process for formulating, approving, executing, and evaluating the budget in Puerto Rico needs to be improved. If we don't do that, we're not going to fix the problem. We may fight until hell freezes over about what an oversight board will do, but if you superimpose a board on top of decaying, inefficient, useless institutions, and the oversight board manages to balance the checkbook in 3 years and they leave and they do nothing about the underlying institutions, we're going to be sitting here in this table in 5 years. I can guarantee you that. And with that, I pass on to Ms. Gordon.